If everything looks perfect before a war, you're probably missing something. June 1944, Southern England. The air carried salt and steel, thick enough to taste. Rows of landing craft stretched across the shoreline for miles, their metal hulls catching the gray morning light like a field of silent mirrors. Engines idled low. Boots moved over gravel. Clipboards snapped shut. Everything had a rhythm. Everything had a place. General Robert Hayes stepped out of the jeep and paused, not because he was tired, but because something in front of him didn't feel right. He had seen staging grounds before. North Africa, Sicily, places where preparation meant noise, confusion, men shouting over each other, plans changing by the hour. War was never this quiet. He adjusted his gloves slowly, eyes scanning left to right. Trucks lined in perfect intervals. Fuel drums stacked with measured precision. British officers moved through the space without raising their voices, issuing orders that didn't sound like orders at all. No one rushed. No one hesitated. Captain William Carter stepped up beside him, flipping open a small notebook, already prepared to document flaws. That was why they were here. Not to admire. To inspect. To find the cracks before the operation that would define a generation. Too clean, Carter muttered under his breath. Hayes didn't answer. He kept walking. Gravel pressed under his boots in steady, even steps. A group of engineers passed by, carrying equipment with careful coordination, their movements almost rehearsed. No wasted motion. No excess weight. Hayes watched their hands, not their faces. Hands told the truth. These hands weren't tense. They weren't rushing. They were certain. He had seen that kind of certainty before, but never at this scale. Ahead, a command tent stood open, its canvas edges shifting slightly in the coastal wind. Inside, maps covered every surface. Lines, arrows, distances measured in miles and yards, annotated in neat handwriting. This was where the real inspection would begin. Carter stepped in first, already scanning for inconsistencies. Hayes followed a second later. The temperature inside was cooler. The sound outside softened, replaced by the faint rustle of paper and the quiet movement of officers stepping around each other without collision. No one announced their presence. No one needed to. They were seen, acknowledged with brief nods. Then work continued. Hayes stopped near a central table. A large map of the French coastline stretched across. It, marked with landing zones, tide schedules, timing windows calculated down to the minute. He leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing, not searching for mistakes, but for something less tangible. Something human. Something that would break under pressure. Carter circled to the opposite side, pointing at a section of the map. These margins, he said quietly. They're tighter than expected. A British officer nearby responded without looking up. They're exact. Carter frowned slightly. Exact was not a word he trusted in war. Hayes didn't react. He reached out, hovering his hand just above the map, not touching it. The paper didn't tremble. The lines didn't waver. It was as if the entire operation had been constructed not just with intelligence, but with restraint. Then he noticed it. Not a flaw. Not a mistake. A presence. Off to the side of the table, just beyond the main cluster of officers, stood a young woman. No uniform. No insignia. No visible rank. She wasn't speaking. She wasn't being addressed. She simply stood there, her attention fixed on the map in front of her. Still. Composed. Hayes' eyes lingered for half a second longer than necessary. Something about her didn't fit. Carter noticed it too. He leaned slightly closer to Hayes, voice low. Who is she? Hayes didn't answer. He watched. The room continued moving around her, but she didn't move with it. Her hands rested lightly at the edge of the table, not touching the map, just close enough to feel its presence. Her posture wasn't rigid. It wasn't submissive. It was deliberate, as if she had chosen exactly how to stand and saw no reason to change it. A British officer stepped past her, adjusting a set of coordinates. Another shifted a mark or 2 inches to the left. The map changed subtly, almost invisibly. Hayes saw it. Carter didn't. Not yet. The woman's eyes followed the movement. Not quickly. Not sharply. Just enough. Then she stepped forward. One step. Quiet. Unannounced. No one stopped her. No one acknowledged her. Her hand moved. 2 fingers. She adjusted the marker back. Exactly where it had been before. No hesitation. No explanation. The room didn't react immediately. It took a second. Then another officer noticed. He paused. Looked at the marker. Looked at her. looked back at the map. No words were exchanged. He simply nodded once and continued working. Carter straightened slightly, confusion crossing his face. "Did you see that?" he whispered. Hayes didn't respond. He was still watching her hand. Not what she did. How she did it. No urgency. No fear. No need to prove she was right. She corrected the map the same way someone might straighten a picture frame. Because it mattered. Because it was wrong. That was all. The tent fell back into its quiet rhythm. Orders continued. Notes were taken. Calculations refined. But something had shifted. Not in the plan. In the space between the people executing it. Hayes exhaled slowly, almost unnoticed. He had come here expecting to measure readiness in numbers, in equipment, in coordination. But what he was seeing now couldn't be written in any report. It wasn't in the ships. It wasn't in the schedules. It was in a single movement. A silent correction. A person who didn't need permission to do what was right. Hayes finally spoke, his voice low, steady. "Find out who she is." Carter nodded immediately, turning to move, but Hayes didn't take his eyes off the map. Or her. Because for the first time that morning, something wasn't perfect. And that was exactly why it mattered. Captain William Carter did not rush. He rarely did. But this time, his steps were sharper, more deliberate, as he moved through the tent toward a British officer standing near a stack of field reports. "Who is she?" he asked, keeping his voice low enough to stay within the quiet rhythm of the room. The officer glanced briefly in the direction Carter indicated, then back at his papers. "She is assigned," he said simply. Carter frowned. "Assigned as what?" The officer paused, just long enough to suggest the answer mattered less than the work being done. Translation. Logistics. Observation. Carter waited, expecting more. None came. Behind him, General Robert Hayes had not moved. He still stood at the table, still watching the map, but not reading it anymore. His attention lingered on the space where the woman had stood, as if something invisible remained there. The marker she had adjusted sat perfectly aligned with the surrounding grid, indistinguishable from every other piece of precision in the room. And yet, it was the only thing he could see. Carter returned a moment later. "Her name is Emily Fisher," he said quietly. Hayes did not look at him. "German." Carter nodded once. "Civilian. Displaced. Brought in through British channels. They say she has a talent for details." Hayes finally shifted his gaze, not toward Carter, but toward Emily. She had stepped back again, returning to her place at the edge of the table, hands resting lightly, eyes scanning the map as if nothing had happened. As if she had not just corrected something that no one else had noticed. Or perhaps something everyone else had chosen not to see. "Does she have clearance?" Hayes asked. Carter hesitated. Apparently enough. That answer settled in the air for a second longer than expected. Hayes turned slightly, taking in the rest of the room again. British officers continued their work with the same measured calm. No one questioned her presence. No one monitored her movements. She was not guarded. She was not isolated. She was simply included. That was what felt different. Not tolerated. Not supervised. Included. Hayes had spent years in environments where trust was rationed carefully, where every unknown element was controlled, documented, reduced to something predictable. But here, in a room preparing for one of the largest operations in modern history, there was a variable that did not behave like a variable at all. Emily moved again, this time toward a smaller table covered in typed documents. She picked up a page, read it quickly, then set it down in a different stack. No announcement. No explanation. The officer at that table glanced at the page she had moved, scanned it, then adjusted his own notes accordingly. Again, no words. Carter watched this exchange, his expression tightening slightly. "They trust her," he said. Hayes nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "They do." Carter crossed his arms, eyes narrowing. "That is a risk." Hayes did not disagree, but he did not agree either. He kept watching. Outside the tent, a distant engine started, the low hum blending into the constant background of preparation. Inside, the rhythm never broke. A clock somewhere ticked softly, marking time in seconds that felt heavier than usual. Hayes stepped closer to the table, finally placing his gloved hand on the edge of the map. The paper was smooth. The lines were exact. Everything about it suggested control. But control, he knew, was often an illusion built on countless small decisions, each one made by someone who chose to act or not act. Emily had acted, without permission, without hesitation, without fear of being wrong. That was not standard procedure. That was something else. Carter leaned in slightly. We should review her file, he said. Hayes shook his head once. No, Carter blinked. No, sir. Hayes' eyes remained on the map. A file will tell us where she has been, he said quietly. It will not tell us what we just saw. Carter did not respond. He followed Hayes' gaze back to the map, then to Emily, trying to reconcile the two. A refugee, a civilian, a former enemy, standing in a room where every detail mattered, making a correction no one questioned. It did not fit any framework he trusted. And that was exactly the problem. Emily paused again, her eyes lingering on a section of coastline marked with faint pencil lines. She did not move this time. She only looked. Hayes noticed the pause, the stillness. It was not uncertainty. It was consideration. The kind that came before action, not after it. He stepped back slightly, giving himself a wider view of the room. The British officers, the maps, the schedules, and her. A single presence that did not match the rest, yet somehow held it together in ways that were not immediately visible. Carter spoke again, softer now. If she is wrong. Hayes finished the thought without looking at him. Then we will know. Carter nodded slowly. And if she is right? Hayes exhaled, the sound barely audible. His eyes did not leave the map. Then we already do. The tent remained quiet. The operation continued to take shape. And somewhere within that silence, something shifted again, not in the plan, not in the numbers, but in the way one man began to understand what preparation really meant. Not just ships, not just schedules, but the people who chose to act when no one asked them to. The clock ticked louder now, not because it had changed, but because General Robert Hayes had. He stepped away from the central table, slowly, as if distance might sharpen what he was beginning to understand. The tent continued its quiet orchestration. Papers moved. Pens scratched. Boots shifted softly against the wooden floor. No raised voices. No sudden commands. Just a system that seemed to run on something deeper than authority. Hayes turned his head slightly. Emily Fisher had not moved far. She stood near the smaller table again, reviewing a new set of documents. Delivered by a runner who did not even pause to question her presence. He handed them to her the same way he would have handed them to any officer. No hesitation. No second glance. Hayes noticed that. He noticed everything now. Carter followed his movement, his own posture tighter than before. Sir, he said quietly, this is not standard. Hayes gave the faintest hint of a nod. No, he replied. It is not. Carter stepped closer, lowering his voice further. We are days away from the largest operation in modern history. And they are placing critical decisions in the hands of someone who, he stopped himself. Hayes finished the sentence for him. Who does not belong. Carter did not respond. Because that was exactly what he had been thinking. Hayes looked back at Emily. She had already begun working through the documents, her eyes moving quickly, but not hurriedly. There was a difference. Speed could be forced. This was something else. Efficiency without pressure. Precision without strain. She paused again, just briefly, then reached for a pencil and made a small notation in the margin of a page. Not large. Not dramatic. Just enough to matter. The officer beside her glanced at it, then adjusted his own sheet to match. Again, no words. Carter exhaled slowly. They are adapting to her, he said. Hayes nodded once. Yes. Carter frowned. That is backwards. Hayes finally turned to face him. Not fully. Just enough for Carter to see his expression. Is it? Carter hesitated. Because he did not have a quick answer. Hayes looked back toward the table. We spend years building systems that force people to fit into them, he said quietly. What if they built one that listens instead? Carter did not reply. He watched Emily again, this time not as a risk, but as a question he could not resolve. Outside, the sound of boots passed by in steady cadence, fading as quickly as it came. Inside, the air remained steady, controlled, almost calm. Hayes stepped forward again, returning to the central map. His hand hovered over the coastline once more. Normandy. Miles of shoreline reduced to lines and symbols. Decisions that would affect thousands, maybe more, compressed into markings that could be shifted with 2 fingers. He glanced to the side. The marker Emily had corrected earlier remained exactly where she had placed it. No one had moved. Its sense, not even to test it. That, more than anything, stayed with him. Carter spoke again, softer now. Do you think they realize what they are doing? Hayes answered without hesitation. Yes. Carter blinked. Then why would they accept the risk? Hayes looked at the map, then at Emily, then back at the map again. Because they have already measured it, he said. Carter shook his head slightly. You cannot measure something like that. Hayes' voice remained calm. No, he said. But you can recognize it. Carter followed his gaze once more. Emily had finished reviewing the documents. She set them down in a neat stack, aligning the edges carefully, then stepped back into stillness. She did not look around. She did not seek acknowledgement. She simply returned to watching, as if her role was not to lead, not to command, but to ensure that what was happening remained true. Hayes felt something shift again, not in the room, in himself. He had come here to evaluate readiness, to identify weaknesses, to confirm that every detail aligned with expectation. But expectation was built on what had come before, and what he was seeing now did not belong to any previous experience. It was not louder. It was not stronger. It was quieter, more precise, more intentional. Carter spoke again, but this time there was less certainty in his voice. If we brought someone like her into our system, he did not finish the thought. Hayes did not need him to. He understood the implication, the hesitation, the doubt, the resistance. Hayes looked at him fully now. We would not, he said. Carter nodded slowly. Because that was true. They would not. Not because it was impossible, but because it would require something they were not used to giving. Space. Trust. The willingness to allow someone to act without being told. Hayes turned back to the map one last time. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter than before, but it carried more weight. This is not about preparation, he said. Carter looked at him. Then what is it about? Hayes' eyes moved briefly to Emily, then back to the coastline. It is about what happens when preparation is no longer enough. Carter followed his gaze, but this time, he did not see a risk. He saw a possibility. Small, uncertain, but present. The tent remained silent. The plans remained unchanged, but the way they were understood had begun to shift, and neither man said anything more. The wind shifted slightly outside the tent, carrying the distant scent of salt water and fuel, a reminder that everything beyond these canvas walls was already in motion. General Robert Hayes remained still, but his stillness had changed. It was no longer observation alone. It was evaluation of something he did not yet have a name for. Emily Fisher moved again, this time slower than before, as if the rhythm of the room had begun to settle into her rather than the other way around. She stepped toward the central table, not directly, not with purpose that announced itself, but with a quiet certainty that did not need explanation. No one stopped her. No one made space. And yet, space appeared. Officers adjusted their positions without looking at her, as if guided by something they did not consciously register. Hayes noticed that too. He noticed how absence of instruction could still produce order. Carter watched from a step behind, his posture no longer rigid, but not relaxed either. Something in him had shifted, but it had not settled. Sir, he said quietly. If this is intentional, he stopped again. Hayes did not turn. It is, he said. Carter exhaled slowly. Then they are trusting more than just a plan. Hayes nodded once. Yes. Emily reached the edge of the map again. This time, she did not correct anything. She only observed. Her eyes moved along the coastline markings, then to the timing notes written in pencil along the margins. She paused at a single line. Not because it was wrong, because it did not match the rest. Hayes saw it immediately. Not the detail itself. The way she saw it. Her hand hovered slightly above the paper. She did not touch it. Not yet. She looked around, just once, not seeking permission, but confirming context. Then she lowered her hand and made a small adjustment. Less than an inch. The kind of change that would not appear in any report. The kind that could not be explained without explanation sounding unnecessary. The officer closest to her glanced down, saw the change, and for a moment, did nothing. Then he adjusted his own notes to match. Carter leaned closer to Hayes. That was not in the original briefing, he said. Hayes' voice remained calm. No, Carter hesitated. And no one is questioning it. Hayes' eyes remained on the map. No. Carter swallowed once, the weight of that realization settling deeper than before. Then what are they relying on? Hayes did not answer immediately. He watched Emily's hand move away from the map, watched her step back into stillness again, as if she had never moved at all. The room continued. The operation continued. But the foundation of it, the part that could not be drawn or measured, felt different now. Hayes finally spoke, his voice quieter than the ticking clock behind them. They are relying on judgment, he said. Carter frowned slightly. That is not enough. Hayes turned his head just enough for Carter to see his eyes. It has to be. Carter looked back at the map, then at Emily, then back again. His mind moved through every system he had trusted, every structure built to reduce uncertainty, every protocol designed to eliminate variables. And yet, standing here, watching a room that functioned without visible strain, he could not point to a single place where those systems explained what he was seeing. Outside, a truck engine started, then faded as it moved away. Inside, the quiet remained intact. Hayes stepped forward once more, placing his hand flat on the table this time. Not hovering, not hesitating. The paper beneath his glove felt real. Solid, but the meaning behind it had shifted. We prepare for what we can predict, he said slowly. Carter listened. And for what we cannot, he asked. Hayes' gaze moved briefly to Emily, then returned to the coastline. We prepare the people, he said. Carter said nothing. Because for the first time since arriving, he understood that what he had been looking for was not a flaw in the plan. It was something deeper, something that could not be written down. Emily remained at the edge of the room, her presence unchanged, her posture steady, her attention unwavering. She did not look at Hayes. She did not need to. The space between them had already shifted. Not through words, not through orders, but through something quieter, something harder to define. Hayes drew in a slow breath, then released it just as quietly. We came here to measure readiness, he said. Carter nodded faintly. Yes, sir. Hayes' voice dropped slightly. We were measuring the wrong thing. Carter looked at him, then back at the room, then at Emily one more time. This time, he did not see uncertainty. He saw clarity. Not complete, not comfortable, but real. The clock ticked again. The maps remained unchanged. The ships outside still waited. But inside that tent, something had already moved forward, and neither man tried to stop it. The room did not change, but the meaning inside it continued to shift. General Robert Hayes felt it before he could explain it. Not in the maps, not in the voices, in the pauses. The kind of pauses that only existed when people were certain enough to wait. Emily Fisher stood where she had been, just beyond the edge of the central table, her presence still unannounced, still unclaimed, yet somehow woven into everything that mattered. Hayes watched her again, but differently now. Not as an exception, as a signal, a quiet indicator of something the room had already accepted. Captain William Carter remained beside him, his notebook still in his hand, though he had stopped writing. There was nothing left to record that could be reduced to lines on paper. Sir, Carter said after a moment, his voice lower than before. If this works, he did not finish. Hayes understood. If this works, then everything they thought they understood about control, about structure, about preparation, would no longer be complete. Hayes looked down at the map again. Normandy. Lines. Distances measured in miles. Timings calculated to the minute. Every element accounted for. And yet, what he had just witnessed could not be accounted for. It had no category, no designation, no protocol. Emily moved again, but this time it was different. She did not approach the map. She did not reach for a document. She simply stepped to the side, allowing another officer to take her place at the table. Not yielding, not withdrawing, adjusting, as if she understood the flow of the room without needing to be told where it would move next. Hayes noticed how natural it was. No hesitation, no correction required. She moved the way water moves around stone. Not forced, not directed, just inevitable. Carter followed her movement with his eyes. She does not try to lead, he said quietly. Hayes nodded. No, Carter hesitated. But she changes things. Hayes' gaze remained steady. Yes. Carter exhaled slowly, the realization settling deeper now. Without asking, Hayes did not respond immediately. He watched Emily as she stopped near the entrance of the tent, her attention shifting briefly toward the outside, where the distant hum of engines continued, steady and constant. Then she looked back in, as if confirming something unseen, and returned her focus to the room. Hayes finally spoke. The ones who ask, he said quietly, are still waiting for permission. Carter glanced at him. And she is not. Hayes shook his head once. No, the clock ticked again. Time did not slow. It did not pause. But something about it felt heavier now, as if each second carried more than it had before. Hayes stepped back from the table, creating space not just physically, but mentally. He had been looking for readiness in alignment, in order, in predictability. But what he was seeing now suggested something else entirely. Something that did not remove uncertainty, but absorbed it. Carter closed his notebook slowly. The sound was soft, but final. If we tried to replicate this, he said, choosing his words carefully, we would fail. Hayes did not argue. Yes, he said. Carter looked at him, searching for explanation. Hayes met his gaze this time. Because we would try to control it, he said. Carter nodded once. That was true. They would assign it, define it, limit it, and in doing so, remove the very thing that made it work. Hayes looked back at the room one more time. British officers moved with the same quiet confidence. Maps remained precise. Documents flowed without interruption. And within it all, Emily Fisher existed without needing to justify her place. Not above the system. Not outside it. Within it. Hayes drew in a slow breath. The air inside the tent felt different now. Not heavier. Clearer. As if something had been stripped away. Not from the plan. From the way he understood it. Preparation is not just about what you build, he said quietly. Carter listened. It is about what you allow. Carter did not respond immediately. He looked at Emily again, standing near the entrance, still, observant, present without demand. Then he looked back at the map. For the first time, the lines did not feel absolute. They felt supported by something not drawn. Hayes turned slightly toward the exit of the tent. Outside, the coastline stretched beyond sight, ships waiting in silence, crews moving in patterns that mirrored what he had just witnessed inside. Order. Yes, but not rigid, not forced. Alive. He paused at the threshold, then looked back once more. Emily had not moved. She did not need to. The room moved around her. Hayes spoke one last time, his voice barely above the ambient sound. We are not just preparing for what is ahead, he said. Carter waited. Hayes' eyes rested briefly on Emily, then returned to the horizon beyond the tent. We are deciding what we trust when it begins. Carter followed his gaze. And for the first time since arriving, he did not look for flaws. He looked for understanding. The clock ticked again. The maps remained. The ships waited. But something had already been decided. Quietly. Without orders. Without announcement. And it would carry forward, long after the moment itself had passed. The air outside felt wider than before. Not emptier. Wider. General Robert Hayes stepped out of the tent and stopped just short of the gravel path, his boots settling into the ground with a quiet finality. The coastline stretched ahead in muted gray tones. Ships lined across the water in measured distance, each one waiting without movement, without urgency. It was not stillness. It was restraint. Captain William Carter followed a step behind, slower this time, as if leaving the tent required more than just physical movement. He glanced back once, instinctively, toward the canvas opening. Emily Fisher was still inside. Not at the center. Not at the edge. Somewhere in between. Exactly where she needed to be. Carter turned forward again, exhaling slowly. It does not make sense, he said, not expecting an answer. Hayes did not look at him. No, he said. It does not. The wind shifted again, carrying the distant sound of boots, engines, quiet commands spoken without force. Hayes watched the horizon, his eyes tracing the faint outline where water met sky. He had seen operations prepared before. Massive ones. Complex ones. Each one built on layers of control, reinforced by hierarchy, tightened by expectation. This felt different. Not because it lacked control, because it did not depend on it in the same way. Carter stepped beside him now, standing shoulder to shoulder, both men facing forward. Sir, he said after a moment. If someone asked you what makes this work, he stopped. Hayes nodded slightly. I know. Carter waited. Hayes took a slow breath. I would not talk. About the ships, he said. Carter glanced at him. Or the maps. Hayes continued. Or the numbers. Carter's brow tightened. Then what would you say? Hayes' eyes remained fixed ahead. I would say they trust the moment when no one is watching. Carter fell silent. The phrase settled between them, heavier than any statistic, more precise than any calculation. Trust the moment when no one is watching. That was not something you could assign, not something you could enforce. It had to exist before the plan, before the structure, before the order. Carter looked down briefly, then back toward the water. We train for discipline, he said quietly. Hayes nodded. Yes. Carter hesitated. But that is not what we saw. Hayes turned his head slightly. No, Carter exhaled. Then what is it? Hayes took a moment before answering. Not because he did not know, but because the answer did not come in the form he was used to giving. It is choice, he said finally. Carter looked at him. Choice. Hayes nodded once. The kind that happens when no one is there to tell you what to do. Carter's eyes shifted back toward the tent. Like her. Hayes followed his gaze. The canvas opening moved slightly with the wind, revealing a brief glimpse of movement inside, then closing again. Yes, he said. Carter crossed his arms loosely, no longer rigid, no longer defensive. We would call that a liability, he said. Hayes did not argue. We would. Carter looked back at the horizon, his voice softer now. And they call it something else. Hayes did not need to ask. He already understood. They call it judgment, he said. The words settled differently this time. Not as a concept. As something real. Something observed. Something that had already proven itself without needing permission. A truck passed in the distance, its movement steady, unhurried, part of the larger rhythm that seemed to exist everywhere here. Hayes watched it for a moment, then let his gaze drift back to the ships. Each one placed with intention, each one waiting for a moment that had already begun long before any signal would be given. Carter spoke again, but this time there was no tension in his voice. Only curiosity. Do you think it changes anything? Hayes did not respond immediately. He considered the question, not in terms of outcome, but in terms of understanding. Yes, he said finally. Carter nodded slowly. How? Hayes turned slightly, just enough to face him. It changes what we think wins, he said. Carter held his gaze. And what do you think wins? Hayes looked back at the horizon, his voice steady, quiet, certain. The part that does not need to be told. Carter did not respond. Because for the first time, he understood that what they had witnessed inside that tent was not an exception. It was a foundation. Invisible, unwritten, but present in every movement, every decision, every quiet correction that no one questioned. Hayes took one step forward, then stopped again, as if the ground itself had asked him to wait. He turned his head once more, looking back toward the tent. Not searching, not evaluating, acknowledging. Emily Fisher was still inside, still working, still unnoticed by most. But not by him. Not anymore. Hayes spoke one last time, his voice barely carried by the wind. We thought we came here to see their preparation, he said. Carter listened. Hayes' eyes rested on the horizon once more. But we came here to see what happens when preparation is no longer the most important thing. Carter followed his gaze. The ships remained. The shoreline stretched. The air held steady. And somewhere between all of it, something had already shifted. Not loudly, not visibly, but enough. Enough to change how it would all be understood when the moment finally arrived. The shoreline did not move, but everything on it felt closer now. General Robert Hayes remained where he stood, his posture unchanged. Yet his attention had shifted inward, measuring something that could not be seen across the water. The ships were still there, lined in quiet precision, their presence no longer just a display of strength, but a reflection of something built long before they arrived. Captain William Carter stood beside him, silent longer than before, his thoughts no longer racing to categorize what he had seen, but slowing, settling into something less certain and more real. A group of soldiers passed behind them, their boots steady against the gravel, their voices low, almost conversational. No urgency, no tension, just movement that matched the rhythm of everything else. Hayes listened for a moment, not to the words, but to the tone. It was the same tone he had heard inside the tent. The same absence of strain. They are not rushing, Carter said quietly, as if confirming it for himself. Hayes nodded once. No, Carter looked toward the ships again. But they are not waiting either. Hayes turned his head slightly. No, he repeated. The distinction mattered. Not rushing. Not waiting. Moving within a space that did not require either. Carter exhaled slowly. We always push, he said. Hayes did not disagree. Yes. Carter's voice softened. Or we hold back. Hayes nodded. Yes. Carter paused, then looked at him. They are doing neither. Hayes' eyes returned to the horizon. No, he said. The wind shifted again, brushing against their coats, carrying the faint sound of metal against metal, distant, controlled, almost rhythmic. Hayes took a slow breath, letting it settle before speaking. When you remove urgency, he said, you remove panic. Carter listened. And when you remove panic? Hayes' voice remained steady. You leave space for judgment. Carter looked back toward the tent, his expression no longer questioning, but reflective. Like her, he said. Hayes nodded. Yes. Carter watched the canvas opening move slightly in the wind, revealing brief glimpses of motion inside, then closing again. She does not rush, he said. Hayes' gaze remained forward. No, Carter added quietly. And she does not hesitate. Hayes turned his head just enough to acknowledge the point. No, Carter absorbed that. Not rushing. Not hesitating. A balance that could not be forced. Could not be trained in the way they were used to training. It had to be something else. Something chosen. Hayes stepped forward a few inches, his boots pressing into the gravel, then stopped again. The movement was small, but intentional. We teach men to follow orders, he said. Carter nodded. Yes. Hayes continued. And to act when commanded. Carter nodded again. Yes. Hayes' voice dropped slightly. But we do not always teach them what to do when there is no command. Carter did not respond immediately, because that was where everything they had seen inside the tent existed. In that space. The space between instruction and action. Between expectation and response. Carter finally spoke. And that is where she lives. Hayes looked at him, then back at the horizon. Yes. The words settled with weight, not as an observation, but as recognition. A truck slowed in the distance, turning carefully along a marked path, its driver adjusting without abrupt movement, without correction from anyone outside. Hayes watched it, then let his gaze drift again. Everything here seemed to operate with the same quiet understanding. Not imposed, not enforced, shared. Carter shifted his stance slightly, his notebook still in his hand, though it remained closed. Sir, he said, if this is what makes it work. He stopped again, searching for the right words. Hayes waited. Carter continued. Then it cannot be written down. Hayes nodded once. No. Carter looked down at the notebook briefly, then back up. Then how do you pass it on? Hayes did not answer immediately. He let the question settle, not rejecting it, not rushing to fill the silence. Finally, he spoke. You do not, he said. Carter looked at him, surprised. Hayes' voice remained calm. You create the conditions where it can exist, he said. Carter absorbed that slowly. Conditions. Not instructions. Not orders. Conditions. Hayes looked back toward the tent one more time. And then you trust what happens inside them. Carter followed his gaze. The canvas moved again, revealing a brief glimpse of Emily's silhouette, still, steady, present without effort. Then it closed. Carter exhaled, a quiet release of something he had been holding since they arrived. We have been measuring the wrong kind of strength, he said. Hayes did not disagree. Yes. Carter's voice softened further. Not force. Hayes nodded. No. Carter looked toward the horizon. Clarity. Hayes' eyes remained forward. Yes. The word carried more weight than any command. The shoreline stretched. The ships waited. The air remained steady. And in that steadiness, something had already taken hold. Not in the equipment. Not in the plans. In the people. In the space they allowed. In the choices they made when no one was there to guide them. Hayes took one final breath, slow and deliberate. This is what we will remember, he said quietly. Carter listened. Hayes' gaze did not move. Not what they built, he continued, but how they stood when it mattered. Carter nodded once. No hesitation. No doubt. Just understanding. The wind carried the sound of distant movement again, blending into the quiet rhythm that now felt unmistakable. And neither man spoke again. The light began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, the gray of the sky lifting into something softer, something that revealed more than it concealed. General Robert Hayes noticed it not with his eyes, but with the way the shadows changed beneath the ships, stretching longer across the water, defining edges that had been blurred before. Time had moved. Not forward in urgency, but forward in clarity. Captain William Carter remained beside him, quieter now than at any point since they had arrived. The questions that once filled his mind had not disappeared. They had settled into something deeper, something that did not demand immediate answers. A convoy rolled slowly along the far edge of the shoreline, tires pressing into dirt with steady consistency, no sudden stops, no corrections shouted from a distance. Hayes watched the movement, then shifted his gaze slightly, tracing the pattern rather than the objects themselves. Everything here followed a pattern. Not rigid. Not mechanical. Organic. As if each part understood the whole, without needing to be told where it fit. They are not reacting, Carter said quietly. Hayes nodded once. No, Carter looked toward the convoy. They are anticipating. Hayes turned his head slightly. Yes. The word carried weight. Anticipation required awareness. Not just of orders, but of context, of timing, of consequence. Carter folded his arms loosely, no longer holding tension, only thought. That cannot be taught quickly, he said. Hayes did not disagree. No, Carter added. It cannot be forced. Hayes nodded. No, the wind brushed past them again, lighter now, carrying less edge, more openness. Hayes took a slow breath, letting it settle fully before speaking. It is built over time, he said. Carter listened. And protected, Hayes added. Carter glanced at him. Protected. Hayes' eyes remained on the horizon. From interruption, he said. Carter considered that. Interruption. Orders shouted too soon. Corrections made too quickly. Structures imposed before understanding had time to form. He nodded slowly. We interrupt too often, he said. Hayes did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was calm, almost reflective. We do, he said. Carter looked back toward the tent. The canvas stood still for a moment, then shifted slightly, revealing movement inside. Not chaotic, not hurried, just continuous. He imagined Emily still there, moving when needed, still when not, existing within the pattern rather than trying to control it. She does not interrupt, Carter said quietly. Hayes nodded. No, Carter's voice softened. She waits. Hayes turned his head slightly. Yes. Carter paused, then added, but not passively. Hayes' gaze met his briefly. No, he said. Not passively. Carter absorbed that distinction. Waiting, but not passive. Still, but not absent. Present in a way that allowed action to emerge naturally, not prematurely. Hayes shifted his weight slightly, his boots pressing deeper into the gravel. There is a difference, he said, between holding back and holding steady. Carter nodded. Yes. Hayes continued. They are holding steady. Carter looked again at the ships, at the shoreline, at the movement that never felt rushed and never felt delayed. And we, he said slowly, often do not. Hayes did not argue. No, a brief silence settled between them, not empty, but full. The kind of silence that allowed understanding to take shape without being forced into words. Carter finally spoke again. If someone asked us to explain this, he stopped, then tried again. To explain why this works. Hayes waited. Carter shook his head slightly. We would talk about planning, coordination, resources. Hayes nodded. Yes. Carter looked toward the tent once more. But that would not be the truth. Hayes' voice remained steady. No, Carter exhaled slowly. The truth is quieter. Hayes turned slightly, just enough to face him. Yes. Carter held his gaze. And harder to measure. Hayes nodded once. Yes. The words did not need emphasis. They carried themselves. Hayes looked back toward the horizon, the line between sea and sky now clearer, more defined. That is why it is often missed, he said. Carter followed his gaze. Because we look for what can be measured. Hayes nodded. Yes. Carter's voice dropped slightly. And ignore what cannot. Hayes did not respond immediately. When he did, it was with a quiet certainty. Until we see it, he said. Carter nodded once. He had seen it. Not fully. Not completely. But enough. Enough to know it was real. Enough to know it mattered. The convoy in the distance slowed, then turned, its movement smooth, uninterrupted, as if guided by something more than instruction. Hayes watched it for a moment, then let his gaze drift back to the tent. This will not show up in reports, Carter said quietly. Hayes nodded. No, Carter added. But it will show up in outcomes. Hayes' eyes remained steady. Yes. The wind moved again, softer now, carrying the faint sound of voices from the shoreline, low and even, blending into the rhythm that now felt unmistakable. Hayes took a final breath, deeper than before. When the moment comes, he said quietly, this is what will remain. Carter listened. Hayes' gaze did not waver. Not the orders, he continued. Not the plans. Carter nodded faintly. Hayes' voice softened further. The way they choose. Carter did not speak. He did not need to. Because for the first time since they had arrived, he understood that what they had witnessed was not preparation for a single moment. It was preparation for every moment that would follow. And that was something no plan could fully contain. The horizon held steady, but something within it had deepened. General Robert Hayes did not move, yet his awareness extended beyond what he could see, tracing connections that were not drawn on any map. The ships remained anchored in quiet formation, their silhouettes sharper now in the changing light, each one a piece of a structure that relied on more than steel and timing. Captain William Carter stood beside him, his posture no longer searching for answers, but holding space for them. The questions had changed. Not what is happening, but why does it feel different? A group of officers crossed the shoreline at a measured pace, their conversation low, almost casual, yet precise in tone. Hayes listened again, not to content, but to cadence. No urgency, no hesitation, just alignment. Carter followed his gaze, then spoke softly. They trust each other before anything begins. Hayes nodded once. Yes. Carter watched the officers as they moved past, then looked back toward the tent. That cannot be built in a briefing, he said. Hayes did not disagree. No, Carter added. It cannot be assigned. Hayes' voice remained calm. No. The wind carried a faint sound from the water, the soft movement of waves against hulls, steady and repetitive, like a rhythm that did not need attention to continue. Hayes took a slow breath, letting it settle before speaking. It is built in the small moments, he said. Carter turned slightly. The ones no one records, Hayes continued. Carter nodded slowly. The ones no one checks. Hayes' eyes remained on the horizon. Yes. Carter absorbed that, the idea settling deeper than any operational detail. The small moments, the quiet corrections, the unspoken adjustments, the choices made when no one was watching. He glanced back toward the tent again, the canvas now still, holding whatever movement remained inside. She exists in those moments, he said quietly. Hayes nodded. Yes. Carter paused, then added, and they recognize it. Hayes turned his head slightly. That is why she is here. Carter considered that, not because she was assigned, not because she was required, but because she fit into something already understood, something already valued. Hayes stepped forward a few inches, his boots pressing into the ground with a soft crunch, then stopped again. Most systems reject what they cannot define, he said. Carter nodded. Yes. Hayes continued. This one allows it. Carter looked at him, the meaning settling fully now. Allowing something did not mean losing control. It meant understanding where control was no longer the most important factor. A vehicle passed slowly behind them, its engine steady, its path smooth, no correction needed. Hayes watched it for a moment, then returned his gaze forward. When everything is defined, he said, nothing new can emerge. Carter's brow tightened slightly. And here, Hayes finished the thought. Something is allowed to emerge. Carter exhaled quietly. And they trust it. Hayes nodded. Yes. The word carried more weight now than before. Not just trust in people. Trust in the process. In the space between actions. In the moments where no instruction existed. Carter looked down briefly, then back up. We would call that unpredictable, he said. Hayes did not argue. We would. Carter lifted his gaze toward the horizon. And yet, Hayes completed the thought without looking at him. It is not. Carter nodded slowly. Because what they had seen was not chaos. It was not deviation. It was consistency of a different kind. A consistency built on awareness, not repetition. On presence, not pressure. The wind shifted again, lighter now, carrying less tension, more openness. Hayes let it pass over him, then spoke again. There is a difference between unpredictability and awareness, he said. Carter listened. Unpredictability creates instability, Hayes continued. Awareness creates adaptability. Carter repeated the word softly. Adaptability. Hayes nodded. Yes. Carter looked back toward the tent once more. She adapts, he said. Hayes nodded again. Yes. Carter added, without disrupting. Hayes' voice remained steady. That is why it works. Carter fell silent, the realization settling fully now. It was not her presence that mattered. It was how her presence was received. Not resisted. Not controlled. Integrated. Hayes took another slow breath, deeper this time. This is what we will not be able to explain, he said quietly. Carter glanced at him. Yes. Hayes continued. Because it does not belong to the plan. Carter nodded. It belongs to the people. Hayes' eyes remained forward. Yes. The words settled into the space between them. Final, complete. The shoreline stretched on. The ships remained steady. The air carried the same quiet rhythm that had defined everything since they arrived. Hayes shifted his stance slightly, then looked back one final time toward the tent. Not searching. Not questioning. Recognizing. Emily Fisher was still inside. Still part of something that did not need to be announced to be understood. Hayes spoke once more, his voice low, almost carried away by the wind. When this begins, he said, no one will remember this moment. Carter listened. Hayes' gaze returned to the horizon. But this moment will be in everything that follows. Carter nodded once. No hesitation. No doubt. Just clarity. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was complete. The light had fully changed now. What had once been a flat, gray horizon was beginning to separate into layers, each line clearer than before, each distance more defined. General Robert Hayes noticed how nothing in front of him had physically shifted, and yet everything felt more precise. The ships were still anchored. The shoreline still stretched. The wind still moved with quiet consistency. But clarity had replaced uncertainty, not because anything new had appeared, but because something within him had settled. Captain William Carter stood beside him, no longer observing out of habit, but absorbing what remained. The need to interpret had faded. In its place was something simpler. Recognition. A group of British officers paused near the edge of the shoreline, not in confusion, not in delay, but in coordination. One of them adjusted a clipboard slightly, another nodded once, and they moved again, no discussion required. Hayes watched the exchange carefully. It was not efficiency in the way he had been trained to define it. It was something quieter, something that did not need to prove itself. They do not confirm everything, Carter said softly. Hayes nodded once. No, Carter continued. They understand it before it needs confirmation. Hayes' eyes remained forward. Yes. Carter let that settle, then added, that removes hesitation. Hayes turned his head slightly. And removes delay. Carter nodded. The distinction mattered. Delay came from uncertainty. Hesitation came from doubt. Neither existed here in the way he expected. Not because everything was known. Because what was unknown did. Not create instability. Hayes took a slow breath, feeling the air settle deeper than before. When people understand the intent, he said quietly, they do not need constant instruction. Carter looked at him. And when they do not, Hayes' voice remained steady. They wait. Carter glanced back toward the tent. She does not wait like that. Hayes nodded. No, Carter added. She waits with awareness. Hayes' gaze met his briefly. Yes. Carter absorbed that fully now. Waiting was not absence. It was presence without interruption. A readiness that did not rush forward, but did not fall behind. Hayes shifted his stance slightly, his boots pressing into the gravel with a soft, grounded sound. This is what we often miss, he said. Carter listened. We think control comes from giving more direction. Carter nodded slowly. Yes. Hayes continued. But control comes from shared understanding. Carter looked back toward the officers on the shoreline, watching how they moved without checking each other, without correcting each other, yet remaining aligned. They are not being controlled, he said. Hayes nodded. No, Carter added. They are aligned. Hayes' voice remained calm. Yes. The word carried weight. Alignment was not forced. It was not imposed. It was built, maintained, protected. The wind passed again, softer now, carrying the faint sound of water against metal, a steady rhythm that had been there all along, unnoticed until now. Hayes listened to it for a moment, then spoke again. When alignment is strong, he said, correction becomes unnecessary. Carter looked at him. And when it is not, Hayes answered without hesitation. Correction becomes constant. Carter exhaled slowly. That was the difference. Not in scale, not in resources, in how much correction was needed to keep things together. He looked back toward the tent once more. Inside, he said quietly, there was almost none. Hayes nodded. No, Carter added. Even when she changed something. Hayes' eyes remained steady. Yes. Carter paused, then asked, why did no one question it? Hayes did not answer immediately. He let the question settle, not dismissing it, not rushing to resolve it. Finally, he spoke. Because they understood why it was changed, he said. Carter frowned slightly. Without asking? Hayes nodded. Yes. Carter considered that. Understanding without explanation. Recognition without verification. It was not blind trust. It was informed awareness. Hayes took another slow breath. They do not need to ask every question, he said. Carter looked at him. Because they already share the answer. Hayes nodded once. Yes. The words settled into the space between them, quiet but complete. Carter looked back toward the horizon, the ships now clearer, more defined, each one part of a system that extended beyond what could be seen. We would try to explain this in a report, he said softly. Hayes nodded. We would, Carter added, and it would not make sense. Hayes' voice remained calm. No, Carter lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again. Because it is not in the plan. Hayes looked forward. No, Carter finished the thought. It is in the people. Hayes nodded once. Yes. The word carried finality, not as an end, but as a recognition that required no further explanation. Hayes turned his head one last time toward the tent. The canvas remained still, holding everything inside without revealing it. Emily Fisher was still there, still part of something that did not need acknowledgement to exist. Hayes did not look for her. He did not need to. He already knew what she represented. He spoke quietly, his voice steady, almost blending with the wind. When this begins, he said, the plan will matter. Carter listened. Hayes continued. But what we saw today, he paused, not searching for words, but allowing them to arrive fully formed. That is what will carry it. Carter nodded once. No hesitation. No doubt. Just understanding. The horizon held. The ships waited. The rhythm remained. And for the first time, neither man felt the need to measure it anymore. The day had moved forward, but nothing felt rushed. General Robert Hayes stood in the same place, yet the ground beneath his understanding had shifted entirely. What had once been an inspection had become something else. Not an evaluation of readiness, but a recognition of something that could not be measured by readiness alone. The shoreline stretched with quiet certainty, each movement within it now clearer, not because it had changed, but because he no longer looked for the same things. Captain William Carter remained beside him, his silence no longer filled with questions, but with something steadier. Acceptance, perhaps, or understanding that did not require full definition to be real. A small group of engineers moved past them, carrying equipment in balanced formation, their steps aligned without command, their pace unforced. Hayes watched their hands again just as he had at the beginning. The same detail, the same focus, but now he saw what had been there all along. No tension, no hesitation, just presence. Carter spoke quietly, his voice almost blending with the wind. They are not thinking about what comes next. Hayes nodded once. No, Carter added, they are already inside it. Hayes' gaze remained forward. Yes, that was the difference. Not preparing for a moment, living within it before it arrived. Carter shifted slightly, his weight settling more naturally now. We always treat the moment as something separate, he said. Hayes turned his head just enough to acknowledge the point. Yes, Carter continued. Something we step into when it begins. Hayes' voice remained calm. But they are already there. Carter nodded slowly. The idea settled fully now. There was no transition here. No sudden shift from preparation to action. The line between them had already dissolved. Hayes took a slow breath, deeper than before. When that line disappears, he said, there is nothing to catch up to. Carter looked at him. And nothing to fall behind from. Hayes nodded. Yes. The words carried weight, not as theory, but as observation. The wind moved across the shoreline again, softer now, carrying less resistance, more continuity. Hayes listened to it, then spoke again. This is why they do not rush, he said. Carter nodded. Because they are not trying to reach anything. Hayes' eyes remained steady. Yes. Carter looked back toward the tent, his gaze lingering longer this time. And she, he said quietly, never tried to reach anything either. Hayes followed his gaze. No, Carter added. She was already where she needed to be. Hayes nodded once. Yes. The simplicity of it made it harder to dismiss. There was no performance. No effort to prove value. Just alignment with what was required in the moment. Carter exhaled slowly. We would have asked her to explain herself, he said. Hayes did not argue. We would. Carter continued. We would have required justification. Hayes' voice remained calm. Yes. Carter shook his head slightly. And in doing that, he stopped. Hayes finished the thought. We would have interrupted it. Carter nodded. The realization was complete now. Not just what they had seen, but what they would have done differently. And why that difference mattered. Hayes stepped forward slightly, his boots pressing into the gravel with quiet intention, then stopped again. Understanding does not always come from explanation, he said. Carter listened. Sometimes it comes from recognition. Carter looked at him. And if you do not recognize it? Hayes' gaze returned to the horizon. Then you miss it. Carter nodded once. No argument. No hesitation. Just truth. The shoreline remained steady. The ships held their positions. The rhythm that had defined everything since their arrival continued without interruption. Hayes let his eyes move once more across the entire scene. Not searching, not measuring, just seeing. "This will not be written down," he said quietly. Carter glanced at him. "No," Hayes continued, "but it will be carried." Carter nodded. "Yes." Hayes' voice softened further. "In decisions. In moments. In the space where no one is watching." Carter followed his gaze. "Like the ones we saw." Hayes nodded once. "Yes." The words settled into the silence that followed, complete, needing nothing more. Hayes turned his head one final time toward the tent. The canvas stood still, holding everything within it. Emily Fisher was still there, not as a focal point, not as an exception, as part of something larger, something quieter, something that did not need to be named to exist. Hayes did not look for her. He did not need to. He already understood what she represented. He spoke again, his voice low, steady, certain. "When this begins," he said, "they will not be thinking about what to do." Carter listened. Hayes' gaze remained forward. "They will already be doing it." Carter nodded once. No hesitation. No doubt. Just clarity. The wind carried the faint sound of movement again, blending into the steady rhythm that now felt undeniable. And neither man spoke again, because nothing more needed to be said. The light had settled into something steady now, no longer shifting, no longer revealing new layers, but holding everything in quiet clarity. General Robert Hayes stood without movement, his presence no longer tied to observation, but to understanding that had already taken root. The shoreline no longer felt like a place of preparation. It felt like a place of continuation. Everything that needed to begin had already begun. Captain William Carter remained beside him, his posture calm, his thoughts no longer searching for structure, but aligning with what he had already seen. A group of soldiers moved along the edge of the water, their steps even, their pace unforced, their voices low and measured. Hayes watched them pass, not for differences, but for confirmation. The same rhythm, the same absence of strain, the same quiet certainty. "They do not change when the moment comes," Carter said softly. Hayes nodded once. "No," Carter continued, "because they have already become it." Hayes' gaze remained forward. "Yes." The words carried a finality that did not need emphasis. Carter looked down briefly, then back toward the horizon. "We always expect a shift," he said. Hayes turned his head slightly. "Yes," Carter added. "A moment where everything becomes different." Hayes' voice remained calm. "But here," Carter finished the thought, "nothing changes." Hayes nodded. "No." The realization settled deeper than anything before it. The absence of a turning point. The absence of a dramatic transition. The moment they had been preparing for would not arrive as something new. It would simply continue what was already in motion. Hayes took a slow breath, letting it settle fully before speaking again. "That is why it will hold," he said quietly. Carter looked at him. "Because it is already stable." Hayes nodded once. "Yes." Carter exhaled slowly, the understanding now complete. Stability did not come from control. It came from continuity, from alignment that did not depend on a signal to begin. Hayes shifted his stance slightly, his boots pressing into the gravel with quiet certainty. "This is what we could not see before," he said. Carter listened. "We were looking for strength in the plan." Carter nodded. "Yes." Hayes continued. "But the strength was never there." Carter's brow tightened slightly. "Then where was it?" Hayes' eyes remained on the horizon. "In how they carry it." Carter looked back toward the shoreline, watching the soldiers, the vehicles, the ships, all moving or waiting within the same quiet rhythm. "It does not break," he said. Hayes nodded. "No," Carter added, "because it does not depend on pressure." Hayes' voice remained steady. "Yes." The wind moved again, soft and consistent, carrying the same rhythm that had defined everything since they arrived. Hayes listened to it for a moment, then spoke again. "Pressure reveals what is already there," he said. Carter turned slightly. "And here," Hayes finished the thought, "there is nothing to reveal." Carter absorbed that, not because nothing existed, but because everything was already visible, already aligned, already understood. Carter looked back toward the tent one more time, his gaze lingering. "She never changed either," he said quietly. Hayes followed his gaze. "No," Carter added. "From the moment we saw her," Hayes nodded. "She was already steady." Carter exhaled slowly. "And that is why it mattered." Hayes' voice softened. Yes. The simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation. Emily Fisher had not become something in that room. She had revealed something that was already present. Something the system recognized, not because it was defined, but because it fit. Hayes stepped forward slightly, then stopped again, his movement no longer searching, but grounding. We came here expecting to see preparation reach its peak, he said quietly. Carter nodded faintly. Yes. Hayes continued, but what we saw, he paused, allowing the thought to settle fully, was something that had already gone beyond it. Carter looked at him, then back toward the horizon. Beyond preparation, he said softly. Hayes nodded. Yes. Carter repeated the word slowly, as if testing its meaning. Beyond. Hayes' eyes remained forward. That is where it holds. Carter did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice carried no doubt. That is where it works. Hayes nodded once. The words settled into the air, complete. The shoreline remained steady. The ships held their positions. The rhythm continued, unchanged, uninterrupted. Hayes took one final breath, slow and deliberate. When this begins, he said quietly, there will be no moment of transformation. Carter listened. Hayes' gaze did not waver. Because the transformation has already happened. Carter nodded once. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just clarity that did not need to be explained. The wind carried the faint sound of movement again, blending into the steady rhythm that now felt unbreakable. And for the first time since they arrived, both men understood that what they had witnessed was not a preparation for the future. It was the future, already present, already moving, already certain. The horizon did not end. It simply continued beyond what could be seen. General Robert Hayes stood in that quiet space between what had been observed and what would soon unfold, his posture unchanged, but his understanding no longer tied to what lay ahead. The ships remained steady. The shoreline held its shape. The rhythm that had defined every moment since their arrival did not break. It did not need to. Captain William Carter stood beside him, not as a man waiting for orders, not as a man preparing for a shift, but as someone who had already stepped into something that required no signal to begin. The air moved gently, carrying the same steady cadence that had been there from the start. Nothing rushed. Nothing paused. Everything continued. Hayes let his gaze move one last time across the water, not measuring distance, not calculating timing, but acknowledging presence. This was no longer a place of inspection. It was a place of recognition. Carter spoke quietly, his voice calm, grounded. There is nothing left to prepare, he said. Hayes nodded once. No, Carter added, because it is already happening. Hayes' eyes remained forward. Yes. The words did not feel like a conclusion. They felt like alignment. Carter shifted slightly, his boots settling into the gravel with quiet certainty. We always believed the moment would arrive, he said. Hayes turned his head just enough to listen. Yes. Carter continued, but it never arrives. Hayes' voice remained steady. No, Carter exhaled slowly. It is already here. Hayes nodded once. The simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else. There would be no signal that changed everything. No instant where preparation turned into action. That line had already disappeared. Hayes took a slow breath, deeper than before, then released it without tension. What matters now, he said quietly, is not what they do. Carter listened. Hayes' gaze did not move. It is how they remain. Carter nodded faintly. Steady. Hayes answered without hesitation. Yes. Carter looked back toward the tent one final time. The canvas stood still, holding everything within it, unchanged, unannounced. Emily Fisher was still there, not as a focal point, not as a question, as part of something that did not need to be seen to exist. Carter spoke softly. She never needed to prove anything. Hayes shook his head slightly. No, Carter added. She just remained consistent. Hayes' voice softened. That is why she was trusted. Carter nodded. Trust had not been given to her. It had recognized her. The difference mattered. Hayes stepped forward slightly, then stopped again, his movement grounded, intentional, final. We will leave here, he said quietly. Carter looked at him. Yes. Hayes continued. And we will carry this with us. Carter nodded once. Yes. Hayes' gaze returned to the horizon. Not in reports. Carter's voice matched his tone. No, Hayes added. Not in briefings. Carter shook his head slightly. No. Hayes' voice dropped just enough to carry weight without force. In how we see. Carter absorbed that. Not what they would say, not what they would write, what they would recognize when it mattered. The wind moved again, steady, familiar, unchanged. Hayes listened to it for a moment, then spoke once more. When the moment comes, he said, they will not need to remember what to do. Carter's eyes followed the line of ships. Because they are already there. Hayes nodded. Yes. The words settled into the air, final, complete. Carter took a slow breath, then let it go. And us? He asked quietly. Hayes did not answer immediately. He let the question exist without rushing to resolve it. Then he spoke, his voice calm, certain. We will remember what we saw. Carter nodded once. No hesitation. No doubt. Just understanding. Hayes looked forward one last time, his eyes steady, his presence grounded in something that no longer needed explanation. They did not raise their voices, he said quietly. Carter listened. Hayes continued. They raised the standard. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled into the space between them, into the shoreline, into the ships, into everything that would follow. The horizon held. The rhythm remained. And nothing needed to change, because everything that mattered already had.